Brothers and sisters, in my weekday prison chaplaincy ministry, I encounter countless men serving time in prison for the crimes they've committed, in accordance with the justice expected by the world. Across the world, societies of a whole range of religions and philosophies have criminal justice systems that legislate that those who commit various catalogued crimes pay the price for their crimes by serving time in prison. As you can probably imagine, some of the prisoners are repentant for the hurt they've inflicted. Some claim innocence. Some claim lack of self-control at the time due to the effects of drugs or alcohol. Some simply don't seem to care. Some ask to see the chaplains. Some are referred to the chaplains because they're at risk of self-harm, and some have no intention of seeing or being seen with the chaplains. I suspect that this last category of prisoners may be closely linked to those who simply don't care about the effects of their crimes. As chaplains, however, we are called to be present, like God the Father, to any and every one of the prisoners, and to bring the Father's non-judgmental love, presence, and forgiveness to all that we meet. I must admit it's not always easy to do this with the fullness of sincerity of heart and mind, especially with some of the prisoners responsible for the most heinous crimes, or those who are indifferent to the consequences of their actions. But brothers and sisters, as you know, it is much easier to forgive a person and have pity on them when they've hurt or committed a crime or sin against someone other than ourselves. It's not so easy to do it when the harm has been inflicted on us personally, and even more so if there's been no remorse and no earthly justice. And it may be exactly about these people that Jesus speaks of in today's Gospel. Central to Jesus' teaching in today's Gospel are the following two statements regarding God the Father. Jesus says that he himself is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Then he goes on to say, be compassionate as your Father is compassionate. What a tall ask, brothers and sisters. Perhaps for a moment we can bring to mind the worst thing that has ever been done to us in our lives. Now, in our mind and in our heart, God asks us to forgive them and love them as one most precious to us. Not so easy, yet this is what our Father in heaven asks of us. Yet, on the other hand, the Church does not condemn the criminal justice systems of the world and the associated incarceration which is used as punishment for crimes. How then do we reconcile this seeming contradiction with today's words of Jesus? As I felt it was above my ability to answer this question, I've had to look back to see what the fathers of the Church had to say about this particular Gospel reading from Luke. Before quoting from the fathers, I'll attempt to summarize what they wrote. As God is just as well as merciful, seeking justice is not a sin, as long as the punishment fits the crime. The Old Testament law, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, attests to this, that we should not seek excessive retribution, otherwise we would fall into sin ourselves. This is the imperfect way of justice, which is only the beginning of peace. The perfect way to peace is to forgive without seeking punishment for sin. That is, that mercy overrides justice. This is how God treats us, and so the perfect way for peace is for us to do the same. Let me now quote specifically what the Church Fathers had to say on this reading. St. Jerome writes, thus our Lord, by doing away all retaliation, cuts off the beginnings of sin. So the law corrects faults, the gospel removes their occasions. St. Jerome here highlights that the quickest and most perfect path to healing and peace is forgiveness with no retribution. Pope Gregory the Great writes, we ought to fear much more for the men who rob us than to be eager to save the inanimate things they take from us. When peace with our neighbour is banished from the heart on the matter of worldly possessions, it is plain that our estate is more loved than our neighbour. Pope Gregory here highlights that salvation of the soul of the person who has done evil against us is a more important consideration than obtaining worldly justice. St. Augustine writes, this law, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, was enacted to repress the flames of mutual hate and to be a check on their undisciplined spirits. For who, when he would take revenge, was ever content to return just so much harm as he had received? Do we not see men who have suffered some trifling hurt straightway plot murder, thirst for blood, and hardly find evil enough that they can do to their enemies for the satisfying their rage? To this immeasured and cruel fury, the law puts bounds when it enacts a law of retaliation. That is, that whatever wrong or hurt any man has done to another, he should suffer just the same in return. This is not to encourage but to check rage, for it does not rekindle what was extinguished, but hinders the flames already kindled from further spread. It enacts a just retaliation, properly due to him who has suffered the wrong. Here we see that St. Augustine confirms the validity of the Old Testament law of an eye for an eye, which was also present in ancient Babylonian and early Roman laws of retribution, and of course we still see today in our modern criminal justice systems and legislation across the world. St. Augustine then goes on to show the more perfect way which Jesus calls us to in today's gospel. He writes, "But that mercy forgives any debt does not make it unjust that payment has been sought. Since then he sins who seeks an unmeasured vengeance, but he does not sin who desires only a just one. He is therefore further from sin who seeks no retribution at all. I might state it yet thus. It was said of them of old time, Thou shalt not take unequal retaliation. But I say unto you, ye shall not retaliate. This is a completion of the law. If in these words something is added to the law which was wanting to it, yea, rather that which the law sought to do, namely to put an end to unequal revenge, is more safely secured when there is no revenge at all." So, brothers and sisters, Jesus, God, the saints tell us that even though it is neither unjust or sinful to seek justice, the most perfect way to peace is to wipe out the debt of sin and crime altogether. I suspect the only reason that this holds true is because of the dignity of the human person. We're made in the image and likeness of God, and thus the salvation of the soul trumps all things, even earthly justice. When a dog mauls a little child, I don't think anyone has any qualms about putting the dog down. But when a man murders another human being, Pope Francis tells us that it is inadmissible to have him killed by capital punishment, for this very act may entail the loss of the man's soul as a result of his premature death. Brothers and sisters, in the first reading we see David in an enviable position of power over King Saul. He could have had him struck dead for the evil that King Saul had done against him. But David took no such actions against Saul, as he recognized his dignity as an anointed one when he said, "Do not kill him, for who can lift his hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt? The Lord forbid that I should raise my hand against the Lord's anointed." And so it is, brothers and sisters, though it is not a sin or unjust to seek equal retribution for crimes and sins committed against us, it only results in the beginning of peace, and perhaps even an imperfect peace. If we truly want the perfect peace in our lives that God offers us, we must just do exactly as Jesus tells us in today's gospel. How much do we truly want peace in our lives? We need to ask ourselves.